how badly is Israel hurting right now, just after this, 12-day war where they were hit pretty hard with these Iranian
Yeah.
missiles?
Well, it was extremely costly. I mean, just if you look at like the expenditure of munitions, both the missiles that they fired, the aircraft that they had to keep running and keep in operation, almost continually, and then the air defense interceptors. It comes out to many hundreds of millions of dollars a day. I thought, I see different figures. I think the other day I just saw one 200 million for the interceptors every day, and then but a larger number actually for the offensive part of their operation, and it comes close to $1 billion, like over $500 million a day. And for a small country like Israel, if it was just Israel, they could not keep that up, for very long at all. They don't have that capacity. Now, of course, they're being supported by the U.S., but that's still, even for the U.S. Well, okay, the U.S. can keep on printing money, right? But at least for the time being, but they only have so many interceptors. They only have so many munitions. We understand that. So it was very costly in just pure military terms. But then also there were strikes on the port, and which led to closing. Not the entire closing down of the port in Haifa, but the major shipping line Maersk, suspended its operations there, and then, of course, the airport was largely shut down throughout. Um, yeah, and so its links to the world which had already, there's the port on the Red Sea that was shut down a long time ago because of the efforts of the Houthis, and is still not in operation. So this was a country that was, not entirely isolated, but which only has a few links, transportation links with the rest of the world, and these had been severely compromised by the attack. And then you had, attacks on like oil refineries that actually led to power outages and rolling blackouts. And these were, again, just sort of, it was just a taste of what I think Iran could, the blows that Iran could deal Israel. I don't know if anybody has actually totaled up the total economic damage. There were also, I think, the Microsoft headquarters was hit. The Weizmann Institute, like the leading scientific research institution there in Israel, was hit and very severely damaged. I think it's probably just going to have to be entirely rebuilt. And all these things, this is all part. These kinds of institutions are part of Israel's advanced economic sector. It's part of the economic engine that keeps that allows Israel to prosper. And these all have been damaged, and they have to affect the calculations again of major corporations and into the future. They're going to have to reassess, the extent of their investment in Israel. It's hard to believe that they're going to maintain the current levels. That I think almost certainly they're going to scale back. So there was immediate damage, and I think, again, as we've said before, there's certainly long-term damage. There's just the
Right.
confidence that countries had, or corporations had in Israel. That was shaken prior to this recent war. Ever since October 7th, they just began to understand, Israel's not the kind of country that we thought it was. And then, this shows, and not only that, it's actually vulnerable to attack. We kind of assumed that it was always invincible. It always, dealt these devastating blows to its neighbors, but it never suffered any of these blows itself. And so Israel has ceased to be the country that it used to be, in the minds of many people, including investors and other political leaders around the world.
Right. I'm just wondering how easy it will be for them to rebuild the structures that were destroyed. Because who wants to invest in rebuilding the structure that may easily become the target again? There's a reason that these buildings were destroyed to begin with. These institutions that are pillars of Israeli society, like the Weizmann Institute and, the ports, all this stuff. It's like, okay, they're badly damaged. We were talking about this current state as just a pause. This war is likely going to resume again. You're in the middle of construction, and then another ballistic missile is probably going to hit it, right? So who wants to fund that? Who wants to keep it going? I imagine the willingness to rebuild in Israel has got to be not that high if they're thinking about that. Just like we're spending all this time and money to rebuild something that could potentially just be shot again if this war starts up, and everybody thinks it, right?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, that's, this is a sort of, this kind of reputational damage is damage that really cannot be repaired in the short or medium term. I mean, it's going to take many years, if not, decades to really repair it, to get people back to the place that they were before October 7th. Israel is a society here to stay. It's normal, it's healthy, it's stable. Everything that's happened now tells you, no, it's not stable. It's not really secure, and it's not normal. And, there will be people who, again, like corporate leaders, whatever they may be, they have their ideological side to them, but in the end, it's the bottom line. And you say, am I really going to risk, $1 billion in this country? I don't think so.
Right. Would you say then that it's fair to say that the world has fundamentally changed since this 12-day war? That it is something comparable to like October 7th or Russia's invasion of Ukraine? Are we in, or is this kind of like step 2 after October 7th,
Yeah. Well, I guess it's part of it's a continuation of the trends that we've already seen. But I think one difference is Iran. I think the perception of Iran has changed, and for the better. Iran has been subject to, this slanderous propaganda campaign for decades and decades, and it really has affected perceptions of the country, from all around the world, even within the global South. And I think actually Iran's conduct during this war, they clearly were the victim. And they didn't collapse. They reconstituted themselves. They fought back and did real damage to the enemy. And I think that has changed the perception of Iran throughout the world, and maybe most importantly within the Middle East. There are these sectarian tendencies that we saw play out, for example, in Syria, the Sunnis versus the Shia, and of course the Iranians are Shia. And so there are segments of these societies that are very suspicious of Iran. But I think just seeing Iran, fight back, first be subject to this attack, really suffering under as a result of the Israeli surprise attack, and then inflicting real damage, has got to change their perceptions to an important degree. Say, okay, yeah, these people are for real. They really do oppose the Zionists. Sometimes you found, I'd hear of propaganda. It's like, the Iranians are just phonies. They're not really opposed to Zionists. I think that was always ridiculous. But now that line is which is propagated often by Sunni extremists, is really lost a lot of strength. Again, I'm just providing one example within the region, but in general, the perception of Iran has changed. And I think Iran's relationship, another important outcome was that their relationship, we'll see how it develops, but their relationship with Russia and China has got to change. I think that they, assuming that they're reasonable people, they have to understand that that they've already improved relations tremendously with these countries, but they have to go much further, to withstand the next wave of attacks. They need the help of Russia and China. So that will just further intensify again a trend that already existed, towards a kind of a quasi-alliance between these three countries. I think that's just going to go stronger as a result of this.
Are you expecting to see some type of mutual defense pact between countries like Russia and Iran or China and Iran in the coming, days, maybe, or weeks before, the war starts back up again? And if that does, then that could just potentially put a cap on it and be like, well, okay, no war because China and Russia will get involved.
Right. I don't expect that. I think countries are usually reluctant to, this is, it's not exactly in the middle of a war, but it almost is. I think it's a lull within a war, and I think countries are reluctant to actually to make those kind of alliances in these kind of circumstances because, yeah, you really are asking for trouble. If you can do it during peacetime, and then and before the war breaks out, you can prevent war. But war has already begun essentially, so I don't think that that's going to happen. But they clearly can do a lot to bolster Iran's defenses and its offensive capabilities. And I assume, and also to help them with intelligence, maybe that was the major failure on the Iranian side, was the deep penetration of Iranian society and government by Mossad and to a certain extent probably by the CIA as well. And that's something they've had obviously some success in uprooting that network, but I'm sure they need to do more. That's a weakness that has to be rectified, and I think they would be foolish not to look for help from the Russians and the Chinese on that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's kind of interesting how these other big powers like Russia and China, they don't have something that's counter to really NATO. NATO is the only organization in the world that is this alliance that's constantly expanding. They like, hey, join our club, join our club. Whereas, we always accuse Russia and China of being expansionists or they're imperialist powers, but they don't have anything like this. It seems very difficult to try to get join their club, be under a military umbrella. They just say, no, we protect our country. That's it. It seems very difficult to sort of form these alliances, whereas the United States is the opposite. If you don't join our club, we'll regime change you and make you join our club.
Yeah,
it's interesting. I mean, and I think it's becoming clear that actually this expansionist NATO doesn't make NATO strong. It actually gives you more liabilities that NATO all of a sudden has to absorb all the potential conflicts that these smaller countries are involved in, and so is that why maybe Russia and China are reluctant to ever create something like NATO? We had the Warsaw Pact, that's over.
Yeah,
there seems to be no desire to do something like that again.
Right. I think they understand that the Warsaw Pact was actually a huge burden for the Soviet Union, for Russia. Yeah, back in the Soviet Union. And they don't want to repeat that mistake. I think that's a part of it. There's no question about it. But then also there is this, what they've said openly, I think both the Chinese and Russia, is that we don't want to engage in bloc politics. We don't want to divide the world into blocks. We believe in kind of an open world. That's what BRICS is all about, this multipolar world. That's their vision. And I think they sincerely believe in that. So there is this reluctance to create, a counter NATO. The thing is that NATO itself has a say in that. It's just like you don't want to have an enemy. You don't want to have the world divided. But if NATO insists on seeing you as the enemy and acting accordingly, you just may not have a choice. And I think that's what they're finding. I mean, China in particular was very, very reluctant to be drawn into this, but the continuing, the incessant hostility from the U.S. to China, and and all these very hostile measures that have been taken against China, has convinced China that they don't have a choice but to strengthen, to draw closer to countries like Iran and Russia, and it seems amazing to me. I think Iran understood that quite a long time ago. I think it was back around 2010 when Medvedev was president of Russia. The Russians had signed an agreement with Iran to provide them with S-300, air defense systems. But then they started to delay and delay and delay. And why was that? Is because pressure from the West, and Medvedev back then was not the Medvedev that we know and love now. He bowed to that pressure. He wanted to maintain good relations with the U.S. And then, they saw in the end it made no difference. You actually do make these concessions. You accommodate, them. You try to demonstrate that it's reasonable. But there's just this unrelenting hostility. And so they learned their lesson. The Russians did. They learned it the hard way. But now they came to they went to the Iranians and said, here we can provide you with a really effective air defense system. And the Iranians refused, because the Iranians under Pezeshkian, I don't think this would have been true under the previous President Raisi, but under Pezeshkian, apparently this is what reports say. It seems incredible to me, but we've heard similar things about Pezeshkians in reference to other issues. Was hoping to reach out to the West to show they're reasonable, show that they were open to a reestablishment of normal relations. In other words, a normalization of relations, and very foolishly rejected this offer. That, by the way, recent events make me think that helicopter crash that killed Raisi, may not have been just an accident. It's not so much because, Pezeshkian became president afterwards. I don't know that anybody really knew that he would be the president and that he would make these foolish decisions. But just that you saw the penetration of Iran, it was exposed by this Operation Rising Lion. We became aware of it. So that makes you think that maybe it extended to some people associated with that helicopter flight. Anyway, that's just a thought. We'll probably never know for sure, but that's just a thought right there.